May 21st, 1924, a man named Jacob Franks walked up the steps to his mansion, and right as he went to open his door, his butler opened it up, welcomed him inside. Jacob was an incredibly successful business person. His fortune, in today's dollars, would have been around $70 million. And so as soon as he walked past his butler into his mansion, he went to find his wife, Flora. Flora was very worked up about their youngest son, Bobby. Bobby, who was 14 years old, was supposed to come home right after school, but it was now 6 p.m. and he still hadn't shown up, and Jacob's reaction to this news was just to feel kind of aggravated. Bobby was generally a really good kid. His teacher was convinced that Bobby was the smartest kid in his entire grade, but Bobby could also be fairly irresponsible sometimes, specifically in terms of coming home on time. So Jacob told Flora, don't worry about it. He likely lost track of time. And as Jacob and Flora are having this discussion, Bobby's older brother came into the room and suggested to his dad, Jacob, that perhaps Bobby was across the street at Richard's house, Bobby's cousin, playing tennis on their private court. Richard and Bobby were quite close, even though they were 4 years apart. Richard was 18, Bobby was 14. This neighborhood was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods, really, in the entire country. It was called South Kenwood, and basically imagine a street where every house is a huge mansion, and every mansion is home to some business tycoon or famous person, literally the richest of the rich. And so Jacob, he gets across the street, he's standing in front of Richard's family's mansion, and he can see the private tennis court where his son and Richard would always play. It's totally vacant. At this point, Jacob went from feeling aggravated with his son to being concerned for his son's safety. And so Jacob would call one of his very close friends who lived in this neighborhood, a former state senator, and he asked him to come over and basically look around the neighborhood for Bobby. The two men left and began making their way towards the school. The school was dark and closed for the night. Jacob was really starting to panic. And so the two men actually ran from the school back to Jacob's house, and when they went inside, they found Flora lying on the ground, totally lifeless, with the phone off the hook right next to her hand. And suddenly she wakes up with a gasp, and she looks up at Jacob and just begins sobbing hysterically. She had received a phone call. It was a man's voice she didn't recognize who told her that Bobby had been. He was safe for now, but if they went to police, something terrible would happen to him. And Flora had been so overwhelmed by what she was told that she had fainted. Jacob, Flora, and the state senator friend stayed up late going over, what they should do. They decided that they would go talk to the police, but they would swear them to secrecy. At the same time this investigation was beginning, on the morning of May 22nd, 1924, a man named Morton D. Ballard drove through downtown Chicago in a luxury car known as a Willis Knight. He pulled this luxury car into a parking lot right next to a rental car company. He went inside and he handed the keys over to the clerk behind the desk. Morton thanked the clerk, he turned around and walked outside where another luxury car was waiting for him, being driven by his good friend Lewis Mason. That same morning, Jacob and Flora received a letter from the kidnapper or kidnappers demanding $10,000 in small unmarked bills, and if they gave this money over, they would get their son back. And immediately, Jacob went to the bank and got the money. But before he could actually deliver the money, the police, who were quietly investigating, discovered a clue that would break the case wide open. It all started to come together when the police brought in Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason for questioning. On May 7th, 1924, so 2 weeks before Bobby went missing, Morton D. Ballard walked into a hotel in Chicago called the Morrison and rented room 1031. And over the next couple of days, Morton would come in and he would get his mail from the front desk, but he didn't appear to ever actually go up to his room. A suspicious maid went in one morning and saw Morton was not in there, and she would actually just open up one of Morton's suitcases that he had left inside. It just contained a bunch of random library books. On May 9th, Morton also opened a bank account in Chicago. He also made his first appearance at that car rental company where he asked for the Willis Knight car. About a week and a half later, the day Bobby went missing, Morton and Lewis were driving around South Kenwood when they spotted Bobby by himself. Now, Lewis recognized Bobby, and he knew that Bobby was an incredible tennis player, and Lewis had a question for Bobby about a particular tennis racket. And then when that conversation naturally wrapped up, Lewis offered Bobby a ride the rest of the way home. And so Lewis climbed into the back seat, Bobby sat in the front seat. Bobby just kind of continued talking about this tennis racket, and as he was mid-sentence, Lewis from the back backseat, pulled out a chisel, and then lunged forward and began Bobby. After that, Morton and Lewis drove towards Indiana. They would head to this particular forest that Morton was familiar with because he was a bird watcher and often came out here. They got out, they checked on Bobby and confirmed that he was dead. So they pulled him out, dragged him over to this drainage pipe, and they jammed him inside of it. And then they drove back to Chicago, at which point Morton called Bobby's mother and informed her that her son was Don't call the police, we'll be in touch soon. The next day, May 22nd, Morton and Lewis would send that letter to Jacob and Flora, but unfortunately, before Lewis and Morton could claim their ransom money, Bobby's body was discovered. And so when Morton and Lewis realized that, the jig is up, they just returned their Willis Knight rental car and went back to their normal lives as if nothing had ever happened. But unbeknownst to him, Morton had accidentally dropped his eyeglasses right next to Bobby's body when they dumped him, and Morton's eyeglasses were very unique. These glasses led detectives to the store where they were sold, and the owner of the store was able to say that, yep, those particular glasses were sold to Morton. Both Morton and Lewis would confess to police that they murdered Bobby. The two men who killed Bobby Franks were rich kids just like Bobby who lived in South Kenwood. They created two fake names. They booked room 1031 at the Morrison Hotel. They just left that suitcase full of books inside of the room to make it appear like they were staying there, but in reality, they needed a physical mailing address that was connected to their fake personas. They began sending mail to Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason, and then after collecting that mail, which served as a sort of proof of legal name and address, they were able to open a bank account in Chicago. They dumped some money into that, and then again, they used their proof of legal name and address to rent that Willis Knight car, and then used money from their phony bank account to pay for it. In reality, Morton was actually a 19-year-old prodigy named Nathan Leopold. He spoke 5 languages, he had already graduated from college, and he was a nationally respected ornithologist, which is someone who studies birds. Nathan's IQ was so high, it literally couldn't be measured. And Lewis was actually 18-year-old Richard Loeb, who was Bobby's cousin and one of his best friends. Bobby and Richard played tennis together all the time in Richard's private court, which is where Bobby's father went first to go looking for his son. Like Nathan, Richard was also a genius. He was the youngest person ever to have graduated from the University of Michigan at 17 years old. Nathan and Richard would very proudly tell investigators that they killed Bobby because of their belief in the philosopher Nietzsche's concept of Superman. Nathan and Richard believed they were so much better than everybody else that if they wanted to kill someone, they should be able to. Ultimately, they both were sentenced to life in prison. Nathan, he would be murdered in prison in 1936 by another inmate. And as for Richard, he would serve his time and get paroled and then die of natural causes in 1971.